Hi, Holly. I'm
Welcome,
glad you're here
Susie.
tonight.
Holly and Susie, where do you hail from?
Hi, I'm Susie, and I'm in Odessa, Texas. Am I still muted? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, welcome from
Okay.
Odessa.
Thank you. So I'm going to be a little bit in and out because I have one more session. So I'm going to have you on so that I can just jump in whenever my session finishes.
I love it. Thank you. I'm honored.
Thank you. I appreciate you giving us this feedback up. I really need this presentation, so I'm glad to
Thank
be here.
you.
Thank you.
And this is Holly. I'm from Lubbock, Texas.
Welcome.
A little further away, but still in Texas. You know how big the state is, so we just expand away.
Yes, and Holly's working on her master's degree
Oh, really? In curriculum?
in language and literacy.
Mhm.
Oh,
Final semester. Woohoo!
that's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you.
Ooh, we have 1 minute to launch.
I think we may want to wait just a couple minutes past 6 o'clock to catch people who are wanting to jump in.
Okay.
Rushing home, eating dinner really fast, you know, that kind of thing. And then, of course, we'll have people coming in and out, I'm sure.
I did hear from a couple that said they would be attending late.
That makes sense.
Good grip. Welcome, Z.
Hi,
Hi, Z, how are you?
good. How are you?
Good. Dr. Kim, we're just waiting a couple minutes for people to join us. I'm glad you're here tonight.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I won't stay long, but I just wanted to be here to support Shona Rose, Dr. Rose.
I am so delighted. Thank you. What
Oh my
a treat.
gosh, Dr. Rose. Oh my gosh, yes. You are putting your knowledge into work, put into use.
He sure is.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Leslie, thank you for having this kind of webinar. This is just wonderful.
Oh, you know, thank you. And honestly, really, it's Shona. This is her work, and it's just an honor to get to highlight her. And a lot of people are logging in right now.
Yeah.
It's just that right at 6 o'clock time.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And we have folks from all over the state. So this is really exciting to see.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So Shona, it's 6:03. Would you like to go ahead and start? Are you ready for us to start this? Or do you want to wait a couple more minutes? Did we lose Shona? I hope not.
I don't see her.
She may need to log back in. Okay, well, that'll give us a few more minutes for other people to arrive.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of our doctor students who graduated and how capable they are, how competent they are. So our students who are in the program can learn from her and from this webinar.
Yes, and we have several here this evening and some master's students as well, and then educators from around the state. And so it's a nice confluence of educators. It's really exciting to kind of see this coming together.
I see Dr. Zhang there.
Yes, and for anybody who doesn't know, Dr. Kim is our department chair in the Department of, well, currently named Curriculum and Instruction. And so if anybody is interested in pursuing a master's or a doctorate, she's a great person to talk to.
Oh, thank you. I would be happy to talk to people about our program. And our LDLS student, Loy Lee, is working so hard to get his dissertation done. And I think Loy learned from you, Dr. Leslie, and Dr. Smith, and Dr. Zhang, and Dr. Saldana about organizing a writing group. So he just organized a new group for my own doctoral students. So they were meeting like on Mondays. Lloyd, do you want to talk about it?
That's excellent.
So I learned, yes, I learned from the writing group, from Dr. Chin, from the writing group with Dr. Julie Smith and Dr. Leslie. So I took that model and I asked the doctoral student in Dr. Kim's class so that we can support each other. So we get online, sitting there, just like to, if we happen to have questions, we can answer each other, but mostly we will sit there and work on our own writing stuff. So it has been a good experience and good writing so far. So I appreciate a lot of that.
And you guys meet on Mondays?
Yes, for the group meeting, we meet on Mondays. So for the last meeting, we meet from 7 to 9:30, but for the next week, we will meet from 6:30 to 9:30 p.m. So that's for the group. For some other, and I have another friend, we meet on Thursday morning together.
That's excellent. Shona is back, and I just want to double check that she has presentation capabilities. I'm just gonna make sure she's still the co-host, or no,
Okay, I'm working on it. Thank you so much.
I think that whenever you're ready, we'll go ahead and get started. And if just tell me when you're ready, and I will say just a couple things about you very quickly and let you get to your
I'm
presentation.
ready and excited to see people who have been helping me for so long to achieve my goals and to find ways to support you guys with how you help other people.
Yes, that's wonderful. And I said, well, in your absence, that this is a nice confluence of graduate students and educators around the state. And we have some doctoral students here, and we have some master's students, and we have people who are educators. And the really beautiful thing about this kind of confluence is that we're all working on the same kinds of issues and questions from maybe different professional positions, but that is really the goal of the Llano Estacado Writers Alliance. And that's the group that is sponsoring this webinar tonight. And we're hoping to do this at least maybe twice a semester and highlight different experts in the field of literacy talking about issues that we know are of importance to all of us, especially right now with what's happening with so much online instruction. So I know that Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and I really appreciate everybody doing one more Zoom meeting this evening to garner a little bit of information that will help you become a better educator or answer some of the questions that you have about best practices with writing, which is what we'll be talking about this evening. So just very briefly, I want to introduce Dr. Shona Rose, and she has recently completed her doctorate at Texas Tech University in curriculum and instruction with a specialization in language diversity and literacy studies. She also works as an educational consultant at Region 16. She has done this work for a few years, and prior to that, she was also she had a long history of being in the classroom as a teacher and as an administrator. So Dr. Rose has really kind of worked in many capacities in the field of literacy. She's also very active at TEA, or with TEA, representing all of us on things like the redevelopment of, or the revision of our current standards. She's definitely a go-to person for a lot of us, and she's a great networker. She has a blog. She has a lot of people who are following her. So she truly is kind of a literacy leader in our area. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to Dr. Rose.
Thank you. It is such an honor to hear you call me Dr. Rose. I'm enjoying that quite a bit. So what we're looking at today is really what happens because of what we've done with our feedback. We want to do it in such a way that causes significant change in the quality of what the learner is able to do. And so with today's work, we're going to be working with several documents that you'll need to move in and out of. I wanted to make sure also that you had access to everything that is in the presentation, including my notes, so that you would be able to return to it later. This right here, you can go to this link right here, the link tree at Shona Rose right here on your browser, and open that up with a new tab. Or you can simply use your phone, because sometimes whenever we're working on Zoom, it's really difficult to handle the screen and see what it is that everybody's trying to get us to work with. So this is an option for you to do that work, and I'll give you a little bit of chance to either open a new tab or to scan with your camera to open it up on another device where you can see the resources as we move in and out of the presentation. If you'll give me a thumbs up when you complete that, I will know that you're ready to go. Thank you, Jen. Okay, looks like we're doing pretty good. Jen put the link for us in the chat. That's awesome. All right, so now what I have is a poll for you. We know from Hattie's research that feedback is one of the most powerful indicators of feedback, but we also know it's one of the most variable. So I could probably spend a lot of time giving you the background on the research about why feedback works and why it doesn't, but I think you already have an idea of what the truth is for your own personal practice. And so if you'll answer the poll for us right here, are you getting the results you want on the time and effort that you're spending on marking and feedback of student work? If you'll respond to that, we'll look for your answers. About half of us have answered. And as we finish the last few moments of our poll, waiting for the last few to answer, what we see is not uncommon with the research about the impact of feedback on the quality of student revisions, as well as the transfer of that feedback to the new Writing Act. Frankly, I've taught first grade and I've taught 12th grade and I've taught college. And many of those students still have the same problems that their teachers, I know, were teaching them and giving them feedback on, even from the first and second grade. And our results are here. Again, most of us aren't getting the bang for our buck about how we want our students to respond with the feedback. So the neat thing about this is the research can tell those of you that said yes. It will tell you why your feedback is working and how you can refine your own personal practices to get even more bang for that buck. And for those of you that the feedback isn't giving you what you want, the research can help you determine what you can do to make your feedback even more effective than what you are already doing. So we'll end the poll here and I'll share the results. Those are what you can see them for your own personal edification there. I think the biggest question that a lot of us have to understand is that what Hattie says is that feedback is actually an exchange, much like what Rosenblatt tells us about the transaction a reader has with the author and the text. The text and the author are giving one thing, but the reader is also giving as well. And what Hattie tells us about feedback, it's not necessarily how much we're giving to the student, but what are we taking from the student that helps us make our decisions about what is happening. And that transaction with the text is going to be very important in the way you plan and conduct your conferences. Today's work and our time that we have together, I believe that we'll be able to cover a lot of the planning process and really show you the kind of habits of mind and things that you can do to refine your feedback practices. Keeping in mind that this is a transaction that you are having with that writer's text, and then a transaction that you are having and receiving feedback from that student, because that's only the time when you have something of value that you're ready to do that. So let's look at how. When you give feedback to student writing, there are a lot of things that we need to consider. And one of them is mapping it out. And what I found over time is this is the paper of a little second grader in September on your left. This little guy was having so much trouble with his writing. And as I worked with his teacher, by November, you can see the significant change that he had in his writing. So what I'm telling you is these principles are very powerful in moving and accelerating the growth of students over time. So let's figure out, how do we map that out? How do we figure out how to take that feedback from the student's composition in a way that routes the path that we take in giving feedback to the students? Now, one of the things that I've found important here is that the research that is the extant research that is available tells us that the time to be giving feedback is when the iron is hot. That means when the student is immersed in the writing process. If we're trying to give feedback to a final draft, the iron has cooled. And whenever you strike the iron when it's cold like that, it often becomes brittle and breaks. And it doesn't bend to the wishes and shape that you wished your feedback to have in its impact. And so to have the kind of impact, we've got to strike while the iron is hot during the composing process itself. primarily in the drafting, revising, and editing phases of the writing. So what I'd like for you to do now is in the chat, comment about what surprises you about this statement, or what does it confirm about your own beliefs? And I'll write the question in the chat for you. What surprises you? And or what confirms your beliefs or experiences? You may type it in the chat, or you may unmute and share your thoughts. Oh, Elizabeth, you're here. I didn't see that you had arrived. Yes, that drafting phase is really important to really find that feedback. It's not time to wait. I do agree, Dr. Leslie, that we don't construct these experiences in a way that allows for that process feedback to happen within the writing process itself. Yes, the timely, real-time feedback. Research tells us that that's what we're supposed to do. But what does that look like and sound like? If we can inform teachers that the time for that is during the act, we'll have better results with our students. Susie says, yes, I had so many of my students come up to me and they say, is this good? Is this good? Will you read this? They're really seeking that out and they want that feedback. And I think later, if they don't get that kind of support, they really begin staring at the blank page because it paralyzes them. Yes, Z, that student agency and that voice that they have to control what they have to say, that it comes from self first before it can be shared with others, and beginning from that place of idiosyncratic nature of the adolescent particularly, but really moving forward to accept what people can do and offer. Yes, how can a writer imagine a reader when writing? Imaginary feedback. There are some strategies that talk about dialogue with self, but that is what is so powerful about what we're going to explore next, and that will be our transition into the next phase, is that that's what you offer the reader or the writer that is the most powerful tool, is the movie of your mind as you transact with that writer's text. Yes, and that research does support the motivation and the engagement and that ability to persist. The feedback is what actually causes that element. Yes, we might need to explore imaginary feedback a little bit more. So what I'd like for you to think about is, this is a piece of writing that I did, and I just put it up here to just show that what we're looking for is those first blots of ink on the elements that we're getting out. We have to let kids realize that it's not supposed to be perfect. And then what they're really asking us to do is, Dr. Rose, what's happening to your mind when you read my paper? Is it good? How can they come outside of self? Because they really have a hard time with that as they're growing. They don't have the capability to see outside of themselves in a way that helps them develop their skills like that. So what I have found is that we have to find different technology applications that allow us to do that, particularly whenever I can't sit across from a child and read to them. Z asked, is it important for all kinds of feedback? Would you elaborate on that a little bit? Go ahead and unmute yourself and share. I love this.
Yeah, there are different kinds of feedback, like negative, positive, um, specific, corrective feedback, and or just like say or a general feedback. So is that it fits, it applied to a different kinds of feedback, or they are stronger or more relevant for some kinds of feedback versus some other kinds of feedback.
You are correct. What we're going to do is really look at what happens with positive and negative feedback, what happens when it's general as opposed to specific, what happens is it's constructive, or if it's just something that says this is wrong. And so those are important considerations to look at in every feedback that it's given. And actually, I've been practicing using this model with some other elements, particularly in helping teachers pass their screener for the reading academies. And it's been really powerful to look at how quickly people grow whenever you consider that. So looking at the technology features, these are some of the ones that are the best that I have seen so far. One of the things that really I have used a lot with is Screencastify, because that allows me to show my face as well as the student's document, that I can gesture with my mouse or highlight where that student, where I'm reading, so they know and orient themselves in their own text as I'm reading. That was really powerful. Another one that was really powerful for me is using Vocaroo. It's really simple, and the kids were able to record their work to me, so I hear their voice reading it as I'm having that actual physical paper in front of me. And that helps me see things like the kid reads what's there, what he thinks is there. Like I had a kid in the study that didn't use the endings of his words. Well, he was not aware that he was missing the ends of his words because he had a visual disability and a thinking disability with dyslexia. And so by hearing him and by seeing and comparing those pieces, I knew that there was a problem that I had to address with that. Another one that I think is really powerful is Bulb Digital Portfolios, because it allows me to enter that student's document and make inline commentary. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of an example of what happened here. Using the inline comment feature here on Bulb, which is a digital portfolio, I had an adult student that was writing from an activity called blueprinting, and she was remembering her grandmother's button box. And so what I did is I just commented in different parts of her text and highlighted the piece of text and recorded my reaction as a comment. I continued with that stream of consciousness and reaction to her writing throughout the piece. And what I found is after we had our conference, using the 4 levels of feedback that I'm going to share with you, is this exuberant response from her. She was able to see her own writing in a way that she could not see from herself, which is what Dr. Kim was talking about, that imaginary feedback. She couldn't, even as an adult, see what it was that she needed to do and what her writing could become. She made some important decisions about revisions and shared those with me, but yet another person in the class as a teacher was looking and recording and thinking about our feedback back and forth to each other. And she was able to see how powerful our exchanges were back and forth, which is what the research is telling us, is that the more you are talking back and forth, the better the students' revisions become. So that is one of your big takeaways, is that you want to increase your capacity to have those back and forth exchanges with the writer. The more you do that, the more feedback you'll have from them, and the more accurately you'll be able to pinpoint their needs as a writer. Now, I'd like to show you another sample. This one right here is in your link tree. And often Zoom is not a very good platform to share videos. And so I have recorded the Movies of the Mind video here for you in a link. And what I would like for you to do is, this is a video of a student who wrote a score point 1 on the 2017 STAR test. I thought this was a really good way to begin because they were, you know, psychometrically scored and validated. What I'd like for you to do is listen to how I had planned this conference right here with the Movies of my mind to share with him the impact his words had on me because they had no sentence boundaries. So I'm going to give you some time to, and it's about 2 minutes. And so I'm going to set my timer. You're going to look at the Movies of the Mind video on your phone or in another tab. And I'll set my timer for 2 minutes. And then we'll come back together and discuss your insights about what you saw there. I'm going to set the timer now. Let me know verbally or in the chat if you need support. I shared a YouTube link since that one appears not to be working. Let's see if that works. If it doesn't, then I'm going to go ahead and play it through the Zoom. All right. So what I'd like for you to do at this point is, what did you notice about the movies of the mind section, and how could that help or support a student because I shared my own transaction with his text? So if you'll unmute and share or type in the chat. I see frowny faces. Are y'all okay? Welcome. We have just listened to Movies of the Mind, and we are responding to how I was reading to that student that allowed that person to understand the impact of his incomplete sentence boundaries. Yes, and one of the things that we found in the research is that if somebody read the text aloud with prosody and expression and their experience with comprehending that text, the students realized what their words were doing to other people, which is the whole point of writing. Our words impact the way others think and feel and act. And if the reader isn't responding to their words the way they wanted them to, they realize the power and urgency of how they need to change that work. Yes, audience does matter. And that was one thing that we found powerful as well. When they knew that they had to share this, or that the teacher would be reading this work aloud, it really increased their engagement and motivation to do a better job. Yes, Jennifer, that is exactly right. Your iPad is correct. I was showing my transaction and my experience with the text. Yes, it did. So one of the things that happened in the research that was really quite interesting is just by reading that text aloud, almost all of the errors that the student was making with spelling, punctuation, grammar, they realized it, and without ever mentioning it, the students corrected these things on their own, which is, I think, so powerful. Now, I heard somebody without their mic on. If you'd like to talk, I'm going to be quiet for a minute. Please feel free to go ahead and share your thoughts. Okay, I guess not. So I have 16 of these examples for you to look at from all ranges of score points from 1 all the way to 4s. If you'd like to peruse those and use them for mini lessons with your students, I think it's just one of the background elements that I did to research and find out how do we give feedback that moves writers forward. Now, I also have a link here to those 16 examples that you can get back to later. I also took how I gave feedback to my niece who was writing a lab report. You can see the movies of my mind and elements of feedback that I'm going to go deeper into with you. So looking at this picture right here, this really is a good example of what we're doing with our feedback. The water is moving, the waves are coming, and the students are swimming and grappling in it. And a lot of times what they're deep into is what it is that they want to say, their intentions as a writer. And the research found significant changes when the students were writing about things they cared about and knew about, as opposed to prompts that they were assigned to. They wrote better and had better quality scores when they chose their writing, as opposed when they were told what to write about. Another feature that I think is important to consider here is most often whenever you look at the surface features and you begin looking at a paper, your teacher eye begins to edit. You see all of those surface level mistakes that interfere with the accuracy and correctness of the paper. Yet, what we found in the research is that when teachers focused on feedback about the students' intentions, about their writing processes, and what it was that they wanted to say, both the surface issues resolved themselves to improve the quality of writing, and the deep issues that were addressed in the conference were resolved. What I have for you here is something that I want you to consider. As I was coding the data, I realized that teachers who were commenting on these things right here in the red areas, their students' revisions did not improve the quality of the paper. And in some instances, the quality of the student paper declined, or they were unable to complete the revisions at all, which surprised me. Teachers who focused on meaning or advanced structural elements or pragmatic features of the text, their students significantly improved the quality of their writing. Z, I'm looking at your comment. It says, how about different readers? I haven't experimented with that yet, but I did a little bit in the New Jersey Writing Abydos Institute that I just taught. And what we had is students were not able to be on the same site. And so it was really hard for me to get them in their peer groups for feedback and their grouping strategies. So I had them record their videos on Vocaroo, and then they had, for example, pointing is a strategy that I had them do. They had to write down words and phrases that help them see, hear, taste, all the senses of what that writer was trying to say. Then they put those into a Google Doc next to that person's name and were able to give them feedback about why it made them think that and why those words jumped out at them. Peter Elbow calls it the center of gravity. It's the thing that penetrates their skull. So I think that you're right about exploring with different readers will be something that will be a powerful thing that we could add to our pedagogy. So as we said before, surface or deep, and that transaction, the more you can move back, the more you can focus on what the student means to say, the advanced structural elements of these topics here, and the pragmatic features of the text itself, the better your students are going to do. Now, I live in the panhandle of Texas, and one of the favorite features that I have here geographically is the Spanish undulating skirts of the Palo Duro Canyon. Really what this is the deposits and layers over time that you can see what's happened over time as the canyon was formed. Feedback in this same way works well because what I'm going to show you leaves a deposit that continues to build and grow to help the students flourish with their new skills as they apply it to a new writing performance. Now, I want to warn you, this next part that I'm going to do, I'm going to go rather fast. And what I want to share with you is just an overview, and then I'm going to go into it more deeply. After I model it, then I'm going to give you a chance to decide how you would plan through a student's writing as well. So don't worry if it's a little bit too fast. I was reading a book called Flash Feedback recently by Johnson. It was just published in 2020. And he wrote in here that this is traditional feedback, and it's exactly what I found to be true in feedback that did not help students improve. I'd like for you to either unmute or chat. Why won't this help? And I'll put the question in the chat. Why won't this feedback help? Yeah, like who cares? That's right. They don't care whenever you just give them a pronouncement of judgment on their work. They don't really care what happened to you as a reader.
You know, like,
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I'm trying, just want to unmute. You know, but why is my voice not good enough? Is like what my students would say.
Yeah, and Jennifer went into there and said that it minimizes the humanity of the writer. It doesn't acknowledge them as who they are, which you're so wise. One of the things that we found is that Hattie described a self-level feedback called praise. But in the research, we were able to recognize the elements of self-level in terms of the learner's characteristics and personality. When those were co-opted as resources and feedback from the student that the teacher could use to adjust their feedback, we saw powerful things happen. And when they were used as criticism, and it did not turn out well. I agree that a lot of times you put academic vocabulary in there, even if they've seen that word before, they don't really know where it is that you're talking about that feedback, or really maybe even what that means. And one person privately chatted to me that, you know, writing is personal. You're really putting your thoughts on paper, your soul in ink. And it is very difficult to be told that it really doesn't measure up. Yes, an audience is an artificial construct. And that's a whole nother problem and bag of worms anyway, because a lot of times the person that the student writes for is the teacher and they don't even care. Now, let's look at this a little bit more deeply. That kind of feedback to me is what I call a dead rat sandwich. It is not palatable. No one wants to hear that. There's nothing that I would even want to add to my writing diet, because it's just kind of offensive that someone would say that and tell me that about my writing. What we want instead is something that is more palatable, something that the writer can actually chew on and ingest, that would be nutrients to really empower that writer and help them do the things that they need to do to be that author's purpose and craft and get their message across to the audience. So in order to understand how we do those different layers, these levels, like it's in the burger, we need to be able to understand the different levels of feedback that will empower us to do that kind of work. And so I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what this looks like and sounds like. The first level I have colored task. And I have colored it that way because as you can see, and I'll show you this in just a minute, I just tore it. I've been using it so much. This is my chart that I used for my conceptual framework in my study. And anytime that I found that a person was giving task level feedback in the transcripts, I highlighted their utterance with a yellow highlighter. Now, let's define what that means. The feedback here says, I noticed that most of the paper is written in an academic tone, and then you refer to Kate Chopin as a badass in the conclusion. Yeah, and I just noticed that Z said that the previous traditional feedback doesn't explain how I make any change with that. So what happens here is they identified the thing that was incorrect. They also gave feedback about where in the paper and what exactly the student had said that changed the voice, that it wasn't an academic tone. Then We also have the academic vocabulary here with the academic tone. That's a very clear task because it tells me exactly what I did wrong, where I did it wrong, what words I use to call that thing in language arts, and it tells me more powerfully what I need to do. But as with all things, one bottom bun of a sandwich is really not enough. We need to do a little bit more with that. So the next level of feedback is what Hattie calls process. And in this level of feedback, there's many different ways that I coded and discovered in the feedback that you can offer process level feedback. This is like where you get to the meat of what's really powerful and happening in that burger, that feedback sandwich. It is really important to give your rationale about what happened to you and why this isn't a good idea. This statement, while funny and maybe true, wasn't consistent with the voice of the rest of the paper. So now you're giving this as a rationale of why we don't do that in language arts or in this kind of academic writing. We also continue to give our readers transaction with this. You tell them what happened to you because they did it that way. And when you said a badass, it served more of as a distraction than a strong ending that I needed to see in your paper. And continuing to build with that sandwich, we have to leave the student with a way to know how to find that kind of thing in their writing when we're not there, or how to know if their revision was powerful. So take on this statement for a minute. The feedback sandwich from this teacher continued with, in your revision, is there a way you can get across what an amazingly strong person Chopin was while keeping your tone consistent? This is how we invite the student to take a bite with that self-regulatory opening probe that helps the writer monitor what it is that they are thinking and saying and how they can ingest that feedback that would result in a powerful revision in their paper. We also see in this final piece, and I'm about to have you reflect on this about what is important about these different layers to make a good feedback sandwich. These self-level characteristics that I believe that you mentioned before about writing being very personal and it takes the humanity out of it. These self-level characteristics were really important because the teacher realized that, for example, this student really loves this athlete. And while she might in her informal language call her a badass, she is still acknowledging this student's strong beliefs about that soccer player and allows her to continue with that. She's also, with this self-level characteristics, allowing that student to maintain their own agency and control over what they can decide to do that. And the teacher doesn't have to tell them one thing about how they can change it because they've already begun to chew the feedback. So what I would like to see now is you unmute or share with me what is your reaction to these 4 levels of feedback. It is specific. It is much friendlier. You notice the tone isn't as corrector. The tone is collaborator with this. That was a huge difference that we saw in the research. Whenever the teacher acted like the corrector and the boss of the writing and the evaluator, the students did worse. When this teacher came alongside as a thought partner and a collaborator, the student revisions were much more powerful in revising and increasing the quality of the student's paper. Nice. The actionable piece was really powerful there too, is that it was something that could actually do something with. For example, the student that I was talking to you about before that read his paper with all the endings on them, his actionable feedback was that he would read and then touch the end of each word. His teacher told him to read over the paper to make sure he'd spelled everything correctly. When we came to the revisions conference, they were all still misspelled. And he said, I read over it like 4 times. And he was mad at himself, and he was mad that they were still mistakes. Well, when we tried out an actionable process strategy that he could physically touch those words, he immediately began to monitor his own self because he had something that was actionable. So I think that you're very wise to say that. Yes, the other thing about that you're saying, Nace, is that it's applicable. They've begun to chew on it already and think about how they can make it work. And so they're already digesting it in a way cognitively that they're going to be able to use it later. It does increase the independence. The time issue is huge, Dr. Leslie. But what we saw that was worth the time is to give the reader's transaction to the text, because that doesn't really take a lot of time, and you can do that with technology. And then the other thing that we found is that by picking that one thing, so many other things were automatically clarified. And what we had was a beginning place for the next loop around. So we could say, hey, you've been working on academic tone. Show me an example in this next piece where you've done that. Great. Now, I think your next place, task level feedback, we begin the cycle in the sandwich again. We give them something else to eat, and they begin to digest it. So narrowing what you're doing limits the time factor. Yeah, that ownership. And Peter, what we were talking about that a lot was the Vygotsky and constructivism and constructionism theories, that they really have to follow those neural pathways and build them themselves. By telling them at task level what's wrong, they're not building any pathways. We're just telling them which path to go down. I love this. The Z, y'all be sure and read what Z says about how she gave feedback in a written form to her pre-service teachers. That's really powerful. And what you said is they stimulate my thinking. That's what happened with these teachers. By looking at what happened when they gave feedback in those ways, the teachers grew exponentially in understanding their own craft. Yes, Manny, you are correct. Highly structured, but open-ended enough to support that student agency and control over the writing. Yes, the hand-holding ends. Oh, I love what Nais says. Yes, it does push the writing forward. And you know, the other thing about it is, how much time do we spend marking papers and hauling that bag back and forth? And what we're seeing is that we're actually wasting our time because none of it changes anything. Self-efficacy, yes, because we're moving that student toward that self-regulation phase. And Fisher, Frey, and Hattie talk about it as assessment-capable learners. Yeah, the time is an issue. And it does reduce resistance because they're willing to do it because you're looking at their own words and intentions. Yeah, and it is less boring for teachers, true. So let's delve into another part before we take a quick break. What we're going to be looking at next is planning the conference. So you have transacted with the student's text and shared and taken feedback from that text about really just what it is. And you've been able to give that back to the student with the movie of your mind. Our next phase, since we've gathered and studied that information, is to plan the conference itself. So the traditional sequence is to discover, decide or research, and do. And what we're seeing is that that conference model is really not robust enough in the planning phases. and the doors remain closed to improvement in student writing. So we want to look at a different way to do that. And what happened because of the research that thrilled my soul is the research led to a new conceptual model for how teachers plan through a conference and how we can have a decision-making model to be able to do that work. After our break, you're going to need to have the planning heuristic and the decision-making models just where you can reference them, because that's going to help you understand the steps that I'm going to lead you through. It's really kind of small on your phone, but I just want you to have kind of a general vision of it, and I'm going to have you look at those things as we go through the next steps. Now, I'm looking for something that I just added. I need to snap out of this present mode and find the little thing. Yeah, here it is. Now, one of the things that I think it's important to really understand about what we're looking at here is what was developed is a heuristic. And a heuristic is just a simple flow chart. Well, sometimes not so simple. But the flow chart gives you the steps that your mind goes through as you're reading a paper and making a decision for the conference about what you need to do to make decision for that writer. So when you look at the feedback chart, and I've got one for you. Here, this is the flow chart that your mind uses to make decisions about what you're going to select for the feedback and how you're going to go about planning and preparing what you will do whenever you give that feedback. So it's 7 o'clock. We've been sitting here for a little bit. What I'd like for you to do is prepare your materials in tabs or either on your phone. And then in 5 minutes, we'll return and continue looking at the rest of how we plan the conference. I'll be online for questions, snide remarks, or rude, whatever questions, whatever you want to say. I'm open to hear your reactions to what's happening.
Shona, I've got to leave. It's late up here and I have to go to bed.
Good night. Sweet
night.
dreams, my friend. So Lee, I'm going to pick on you. Can you hear me? You watched my first proposal. What do you think about what's happened over time? All right, so it's about time. I'll stop the timer and let's look deeper into how can we use this model to give feedback to a writer. I want to begin with the writer that we looked at before. Now, you know that he made a 1. So in your feedback chart, your heuristic, or this feedback decision-making model that you have, your first step, it says, does the writing meet the assignment criteria, prompt, rubric, or success criteria? And what we have to say here is that no, it does not. From there, if we were able to say yes, we could ask these questions, but we know the answer was no. So we move to this next phase here. And so I'm moving down on my chart that I think about what was the biggest barrier to my experience as the audience. Well, really, it was hard to read because of the sentences. There were only 2 in the entire thing, and they ran all the way together. But whenever I think about if he corrected those things, that kid was still going to make a 1 because the rubric for STAR privileges depth and development. And so having him fix that still isn't going to make him rise the quality of his text. Plus, by reading that text aloud to him as a transacting reader, I think he's going to fix that stuff already. So these are the questions that I think about as I move through and decide what I'm going to focus on and consider with what this writer needs to improve. Now, if I were going to, and I'm just going to tell you, most of the people, whenever they look at this essay, they hone in and nail this kid on the presentation elements. His handwriting is bad. His presentation and format, the way he does the margins and all of that, it's just ugly. He's misspelled stuff. His punctuation is bad. He just really has not nailed those elements. But again, what I see with this is those things are going to help him, but they're not going to improve what happens with his writing. And I want to hone in on that just a little bit more. Looking at this right here and thinking about if we focus on those surface level features, let me show you why this isn't going to help him. There is a skill that you can develop and a test or an evaluative measure that you can use called index of control. And I'm just going to walk this through with you. I made a video about it, but what I did is I wrote the alphabet down here on the left. And I went through and I wrote every single word that he used in this text. And then I just did some calculations. He had 87 total words, and 66 out of those 87 words were different words. This kid isn't editing himself to just use words that he can spell, and I want him to do that. I don't want his right brain to be overcome by the left brain editor that would keep him from saying anything important at all because he was over-focused on spelling. Note that he's only misspelled 7 of these 87 words. So whenever I look at the percent of words that he spelled correctly, this kid is spelling 92% of the words correctly. And he's using a lot of different words. That's something to praise this child for, not to criticize him for. And so I think that that's a really important point that we need to hone in on about the focus of surface features. So if you would give me a reaction to the index of control, either with, a facial expression, a comment, a thumbs up or a thumbs down, I'd love to hear what you think about this index of control idea and why it's not a good idea to focus on surface features with this student. Had y'all ever seen it before? No? I mean, it's a powerful visualization for teachers to understand really what the kids are doing. Any other comments? Yeah, yeah. And Manny would see his writing in well, if his name was Manny, Manny pointed out this, that he sees it differently. But the child who wrote this would see his writing in a different way, and he would leave empowered, not paralyzed by his poor spelling. So the other element that we could look at that's a surface level feature is his grammar, his syntax, word issues. These are all the cueing sources that we look at whenever we are trying to figure out what's going on with his writing. Those again are all the surface level features that really don't improve the writing. There are things that we can do to help him fix those things with process and self-regulatory feedback that they need. Honestly, he needs help with his sentences. But is that the one thing that's going to give me the bang for my buck that will improve the quality of his writing? As a matter of fact, as Michael Laddick, my friend who has just joined us, would tell you, that we really have to look deeply into what is most going to impact the writer. Yet, unfortunately, what we have seen is that teachers move with their red pen and sink one boat after another to bring in the sharks of despair into the writing world, to where students are now disenfranchised and no longer view themselves as writers. And those practices have to change. Let's instead focus on the humanity, as you have said, of what it is that we intend to say. Because once we care about what we say and believe in the power of what we can do, we care more about the reader's experience with the surface features, and they correct themselves. So this meaning, when we focus on these elements of what this student is saying, that's a really powerful thing. Now, I think that this kid has done a pretty good job with his anecdote here. We can understand that people were working together to accomplish a goal. We got that. I didn't really see a thesis statement in his work, so that's a problem that I could focus on. He had some really good examples about what they were doing. It was coherent, it was logical, it was a good sequence of the story. It just didn't have enough depth. And so what I have to look at is these advanced structural components of this. And what we see in this student's work is he doesn't realize, or she doesn't realize, we don't know if it's a female or a male, that whenever you offer an anecdote, it's not enough for an informational or expository task. If you were offering an anecdote, it must always be explained in how that anecdote supports the thesis. I'm looking at Z's question right here. Yes, Z, and some of what you're talking about is really important because there's a difference between form and formula. We do have an essay form. We have a body and way that we communicate ideas, but when we say that it has to have 5 paragraphs or it has to have an introduction, a body, and conclusion, in the research what we had is teachers said, okay, we've got to have your introduction, then you've got to have your thesis, and then you've got to have your specific idea about an example from your life. And then you've got to have a specific idea about something you've read or something from history. Then you've got to have it, and what we had is just this list. And what we see in the state is that listing is resulting in bad writing, and they don't pass. And so that's really another thing that was verified by the research, is that whenever teachers are trained, particularly at the secondary level, in writing as a process, as opposed to teaching formula, if they were trained in writing as a process, their students do better. If they were not trained in writing as a process and they follow formula, their students do worse on writing tasks. So I want to model with you how I would go through giving feedback to this student. So I decided that for my task level feedback, and I'm going to go ahead and model with Cami right here. what I see here that I want him to know is that he doesn't have a thesis and that he's got an anecdote that remains unsupported. But, so that's my task feedback to him. So what this means is that I have to say, you know, for this audience, when you're writing for assessment, they have a checklist and they're looking for certain things. And one thing they're looking for is your thesis and your introduction. And the other thing they're going to be looking for is, do you develop your ideas? What you've done here is lovely. You're going to give me a really good example of some experience that you had that says that you work together. Now, watch what I do next. All right. One of the things that I notice that you said, I'm going to turn on the light. It's getting too dark for me. So I'm pretending to talk to this student. And see this part where you said my neighbors? And so I'm clicking on the comment box right here. So in my neighbors, what I'm going to put here is a number 1. And your ideas have generalizations. And I think about, what does it mean that your neighbors started helping?
D.
And what we see here is that one person inspired many to join the effort. Okay, so that's my strategy. I'm looking for, what did my anecdote mean? And now what I can use is this right here can become the topic sentence for my next paragraph to develop and explain how my writing and my anecdote supports the thesis. Another one that I can do is, when this whole thing all the way through, we see that this student, he explains the before and the after. And so what we see here is we've got a problem and solution, or a before and after. Working together causes a big change. And then whenever you see right here, when he says pretty soon, that's another point. Working together causes change in a short time that one person alone could not accomplish. Another thing that I can do is I can make comments down here about other elements that his generalizations are providing. And so what I want to make sure that I'm doing here, and I'm going to skip some pieces and show you what I actually did in my planning. I wanted to show him how a strategy to see when his sentences were too long. And so I had him color. This is a specific process level strategy to color the sentences in one color and then change whenever he had a period in a capital letter. That way he can start to see where he would need to divide those sentences. Plus, if this writer now has 6 different topic sentences that she can use to compose and develop the ideas that would be in the following paragraph. I also want to make sure that I have a mentor text that has some elements that the student can use to see the gap. So what we can see here is I have an anecdote just like you had. What do you notice that I have in this, and I'm using my self-regulation probe, what does this writer put before the anecdote that you have not used? And so they would respond that they haven't added a thesis. Well, that's easy to fix. Can you go add one of those real quick? And they would write it down. Then what I can do is I can show that the anecdote, each one of them had a place by challenging each other as a team able to collect more trash in a short amount of time. And so each one of their generalizations, we could go back and trace them to what part of the anecdote matches the elements down here. And so the writer can begin to see an exemplar of what that kind of writing looks like and sounds like, and how writers get their ideas to develop and progress through there. So at this point right here, that's quite a bit. I've walked through, and I'm going to show you my planning sheet right here. This is the one that I used whenever I was trying to plan out the levels of feedback. I have walked through what's wrong with this paper, why it didn't work, what he can actionably do to fix that work, and giving him a way to evaluate and see the gap and what he needs to do to improve. So it is now time to reflect again. And so what I would like is for 3 people to be brave enough to unmute their mic and describe what your reaction is to this first walkthrough of feedback to this student's writing. What did you see me do, and how did I think in order to plan that feedback through the 4 levels? 3 brave folks.
I like this is Susie. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Susie, please continue.
Okay. So I like this because visually for me even, it takes my brain to sections. And so I don't have to look at the entire paper. And if I'm this writer, I don't have to feel overwhelmed by what was wrong with it. And so I can look at, okay, there's good things to my paper. So giving that type of feedback, because again, it's just clever in terms of having them use a different color to pick their own brain of where they could go next. So you're just giving the cues based, I mean, to me, this is what it sounds like, right? That you're giving the cue and then they can move with that, but at the same time, so it's empowering because it's not criticizing the actual writing. It's helping them develop the actual writing itself.
Susie,
So,
do you know how empowering it is for me to hear you validate that? I mean, that's so important, and I really thank you for that. That just kind of floated my boat for the next 3 weeks, I'm sure.
I have something just briefly to add to this. I kind of hesitate to talk because I'm, hosting this with you as a, our honored guest. But one of the things that strikes me about your approach to this feedback beyond the levels is that you start from this premise that the student is a capable writer. Mm-hmm. And I think that is so very important, that you're not going in to correct, you're going in to understand. And kind of, if you look at your marginalia, you're dissecting, and it's to understand, and it's to think, and it's to mirror back to the student what you're seeing. So I just kind of wanted to share that because I'm so struck by the stance.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the stance is critical because what you're doing is you're a mirror that shows them back. You give them back their words with your transaction. You give them back their craft by pointing out what it is that they've done. Okay, one more. One more brave person. Michael, speak up. You know you have something to say.
I'm trying to catch up there, Shona. I really am. I mean, all I can see is I'm just trying to make the connections. Like I think of students that I have that struggle in reading. Mm-hmm. So I just want to touch on and writing. And so just something that Dr. Leslie would appreciate is that even if it's in segments, even if it's small, you can do what you did. So imagine for a second that the child only wrote what was in the yellow. Yes. You could do the same thing that you did in the yellow in smaller parts. So instead of them being concerned or concentrated on the length of what they wrote is more important. And so then you can do the same segment. Oh, look, you used words like horrible, you connected looked horrible, and you know, all the little things that say, look, you have something to say, let me show you how you can, not only what you said is valuable, but how it can be better. So I was trying to bring my own practice up to speed here. You'll have to excuse me, I'm adjusting my eyes a little bit.
I know you've just arrived, but you know, I have to harass you a little bit. But what you point out is really important here, is that particularly these pieces right here where I'm adding, Michael talked about the reader's process. And what we are doing right here is we're helping the reader as well, because these right here are generalizations. This is what these things mean. This is why the author put them there. And so we're really diving into things that help a writer comprehend more whenever they read. So that really is a side outcome of the research that is very powerful, because it helps them do both. I'm looking at feedback in the chat. Y'all can look at that over too. Yes, you know, one of the things, I have friends that are counselors, nice, and they have a decision-making model that they follow to plan how they're going to counsel people. Why don't we have one of those? I need help in making decisions. And what I found with the feedback, and one of the most astounding thing people said, is they got stuck in the process because our teachers didn't know what strategies that were concrete enough to give to the kids. And that's, I think, where my research is headed next, is to figure out what are those things that we can tell students to do that are concrete and actionable that will inform that. Yeah, the exemplars are so powerful. Yep, you nailed it. So as we move toward the last phases of our time together, one of the things that we saw is whenever the teacher was going through the good job. Yeah, I like that. You had an introduction here. You said that here. Yeah, you use a specific example right there. That did not work. It really had to be a reference to something more like this image right here. When the feedback was very specific, like I'm talking about right here, and connected to who the student was, if you try to peel away the student's self and their knowing and their funds of knowledge, like Dr. Leslie was talking about, they're a capable writer. They've been alive for a certain amount of time and they put down on paper the best they could. You can't separate the student's learner characteristics from your considerations about how you plan the feedback. That was really evident in the research. For example, there was this one kid that the teacher said, I have to be really careful what I say to him because he'll just do what I say because he wants to do, you know, he'll just do it without thinking and really understanding what I mean. And so you really have to think about that in level of the student's characteristics. So these things right here become more important than praise. Is whenever, like I was at a really difficult PLC yesterday, and I just started naming the feelings and what was happening and all of these things about what was happening to them as teacher learners. And the teacher just started bawling and she said, you nailed it. I feel like I was heard. And what this does with our writers is I feel like you know me and honor me as a person. You understand the way I learn and you're going to find something that fits me and not my paper. And that focus that the teachers had when they stopped praising the kids and they started considering who they were and why they were and how they were, their feedback had a completely different impact than it was whenever they were praising students. So when we work this way through a conference, our last phase in here is to select a this is the last pieces of what you do. And so what you do is you use your chart, the heuristic that we have that I've torn up. So now you're in the blue. And what you want to think about is opening the conference with a self-regulatory question. And this was just like how we began. How do you think you can maintain your academic tone in your conclusion that doesn't distract the writer. Then that's because you've selected one thing, not a million, and that's why this works, is because you're selecting that one thing and it takes a little bit of time and not much at all. You're going to jot down that focus because it's probably going to be 2 or 3 days before you get to talk to the student again. Then this is the part where our research and our collective work and knowledge together needs to be, is what do we give these students if that's their problem? What is a concrete and actionable thing that I can do? And if I don't know it, I need to pick something else. The next thing that we do is we plan that invitational opening that honors them as writers and establishes us as that person that's coming alongside them as a collaborator and a co-creator and a thought partner to open the conference. Then we're going to think about, and this is what we'll get into in if we meet together again about conducting the actual conference, is how do we spiral down to find exactly where that student's knowledge or writing process is breaking down. Why didn't they include a thesis? Why didn't they explain their anecdote? And we figure out what those things are, and we've got a plan for what that is. We also have to be ready, if they think they need to work on something else, we got to be ready to go with that too. And so I've replicated the self-regulatory probes here at the end of the PowerPoint here. And the last part we want to do is jot down concise notes about your feedback plan and the locations or line numbers in that student text so that you'll be able to reference them quickly. Because again, it's probably been a while since you've had that paper and you want to quickly orient them to the place. And you can begin with your task, process, self-regulatory, and learner characteristics feedback sandwich in a way that leads to, remember the Spanish skirts? It's a pretty arid place right here, but this gives us a different picture about what our feedback could do if we do this over time. We can begin with that one thing about adding the thesis, about the endings of words, about explaining the anecdote, because the next time we meet, we'll say, show me where you, now let's work on. And so as over time, the student grows and becomes more robust and sophisticated with their writing, and they have the foundations and deposits of all the work that you've done in the past in a way that builds and provides a place of growth that they can use for all kinds of things over time, for now, this paper and the next one. So part 2, if you wish to join me, will be how we conduct the conference. But now we have a blank slate open for your questions and your comments and your ponderings and wonderings. Okay, we have a question. Did you tell the students what you will discuss prior to the conference so they can focus on the deep aspects of their compositions? No, in the study we did not. Susie, you're right, because what we saw in the teacher that had this stance and used these methods, I wish I had the quotes out and ready for you about what she said about herself. And she continues to kind of watch what's going on, and watching her growth and her sophistication is amazing. And to see what her students were able to do over time, it was just crazy cool. Other questions that you would like to pose to the group? I think I'd like to know, what do you want to do, because you know this now.
Does anybody have a question about how to do this in an online environment in a way that's effective? And I know Dr. Rose was highlighting some different tools that you could use to give feedback to students or to listen to them, for instance, reading their writing, like Screencastify or Vocaroo, but does anybody have questions about kind of your current context and how you have this kind of what it feels like to me is a very dialogical approach to giving feedback to students, even though there's a very clear scaffold and structure to the feedback, there's still so much that is about the transaction and what the student brings and how the student responds. And then how, as a teacher, you have to kind of pivot from that. And so even though you plan, there's also this spontaneity because it is very much kind of a two-way process. So I was just sort of curious if anybody had a question about that. It's a question I have, I guess. So Dr. Rose, if you'd like to answer that, but also just see if others have a similar question.
I have an example of how we made this work. I'll share my screen again. When I was teaching the Abydos Institute, I was charged with figuring out how to do it asynchronously, synchronously, and face-to-face all at the same time. Yeah, that was something. And so I put this exercise up here about pointing, and if they couldn't join the group at 10:30, they were supposed to record themselves reading their writing aloud and then listen to the recordings of others and give feedback using these prompts. What words and phrases help you see, hear, or feel what the author intended to convey, and why were these words effective? So I saw that Kim did her work right here. See, there's a chat.
Kim, and this is my piece from Uninterrupted
So you can see that she's videoing herself in her home. You can see also that I was able to respond to Kim and her writing here with my own video. And I had to stop sharing that because the internet was unstable. But I think that gives you an example of what that was like. I also had a form, a Google form, that they typed in the name of the person who they were listening to their writing, and then they answered the questions in the form. And then I shared the responses so they could see what other people were saying about their writing. And in turn, they could go and highlight the places in their writing that other people commented on. And then they had a conference with me to talk about what did people highlight and how did that inform you and change you as a writer.
Yeah, that's excellent. I just want to pick up on what Nais also posted in the chat about kind of moving seamlessly from online to in-person instruction or face-to-face instruction. And that what I'm seeing is that there's kind of this panic about we're online, we don't know how to do this. And it's more everybody looking at the tools instead of thinking about, you know, the best practices for teaching. Like, why would I want students to discuss with each other, for instance? Why would I even want them to do that? Then thinking about tools that would be helpful. Or why would I, in this case, give feedback, or how would I give feedback to students that is predicated on research or best practices, and then think about the ways to bring that about. So I just wanted to highlight that because it's so true.
I think he's correct, and I want to nail that in as well, is that meeting with writers online has been so powerful to put up a piece of our writing and share it in a breakout group and to talk about what I'm writing, and watching the teenagers do that has been just incredibly powerful. It's completely transformed the culture. It's transformed their engagement. It's transformed the length and quality of what they're writing. And we are participating just like all of us are participating right now. And to be able to throw that writing up on the screen and see it and hear it and have the discussion about it has just brought that humanity and, you know, just that community building in a beautiful way that I didn't think we could do online.
Shona, when you've done this and developed, have you intersected this with like people who do curriculum mapping? You know what I mean? Have you thought about, you know, putting this in as far as you know, a form of feedback within the actual, like the product, like, you know, we teach, what are we teaching, how, and then we get into how are we teaching it. And then, you know, that crossover there is real important to build. And I'm just wondering, we've talked a lot about content-based literacies, and I understand that this is probably more for the, you know, the language arts, but for those of us in different content areas, I was just curious if you've worked on any of that.
Actually, I have. And what I've been doing is I've been trying to create a curriculum sequence that embeds both what we do with reading pedagogy and writing pedagogy, and creating the feedback communities and the feedback cycles. I'm working on it. It seems to be working pretty well. I'm trying it out in a high school, a middle school, and with a homeschool. So we'll see. But I hadn't really thought about it in that way, Michael. Thank you.
Did you see Z's comment? Can you address that a little bit about, you know, you're talking about how it's still powerful to go through a writer's workshop in essence, but what's different about being in an online space?
I think you have to be explicitly planning for the things that are your goals. And so what's been fun about the asynchronous and online stuff is that I've been more able to deeply interact with their work because I can fly on the keyboard and I can make comments. And then I get an email, if it's on a Google Doc, that they've done something with what I've asked them to do. And so it becomes this constant barrage and back and forth between us about the feedback that I think it is. That's another reason why I thought that it was really important for the students to either record themselves with Screencastify or with Flipgrid, or just their voice. And I know a lot of them don't want to put it on Flipgrid because they don't want their peers to see it. And so I have to work through what that means and how to do those things. And so those are like mini lessons underneath that. And just like the progression of feedback that we give, we start out with pointing, then we do highlighting, then we do summarizing, then we do say back. There's a progression of feedback that we use that starts out with a really safe place and moves into something that is really powerful and robust. But you have to gradually finesse that as you go along to meet their social emotional needs.
Also, like for asynchronous situation, like some students, they didn't read the teacher's feedback for a long time because we cannot control. So I think the time issue seems like it also depends on student motivation. Mm-hmm. And in some situations, we just cannot have that because like if they don't read the feedback for a long time.
Mm-hmm. What we find is if they will meet with us for feedback and they experience in this way, they do read it. And so I think it does require establishing that community, or maybe even doing a fishbowl of what it looks like and sounds like to give and receive feedback. You have to build that into your continuum so that they seek that feedback. And one of the things that we started doing as well is we have a conference sign-up form that the students are the ones that have to request the feedback, and we show them how to do that. So we're kind of working on that.
That's right, because like you can require students, so they have their schedule to regulate.
I don't have answers for that yet. But what I've seen is that it's not that big of a problem, because what they got from participating in the conference that way was so valuable to them that they couldn't wait to get the feedback.
Oh, okay, I see your point. Thank you.
Did you see Loy's question?
Yeah.
Good question.
How you accommodate your ESL and SPED students in your feedback strategies. So when I looked at the Kami extension, it also has a translate feature. And so I was practicing figuring out how I could use that to translate that into the other languages. I haven't played with it a whole lot, but it seems to show promise. The Google Docs, whenever I'm, and even with the Cami, I can talk and I can transcribe what I'm doing. And so at least they have it in 2 modalities. And if it's in the Google Docs, I can do the same by recording and adding the comment. And then there's the Explore feature on the side that allows them to translate. And so that seems to be a bridge when they need it. In the study that we did, we had one student that had participated in a conference where her teacher, I think, if I remember the data, there were 300 or 400 different elements the teacher wanted the student to repair in her paper, which was too much. And she couldn't revise. And so what we ended up doing, somebody's at my door. What we ended up doing, what we ended up doing is we wrote with them. And I typed while that student talked. And that seemed to be a really good method to get it started because she was so paralyzed she couldn't move forward. Yeah, Susie, I'm going to go unlock the door.
Hey, Dr. Leslie, I have a question for you. Have you worked on this with coaching, as far instructional coaching with teachers on this process? I was going to ask Shona this. I know you've probably dabbled in this. This is something that our alternative education program has worked on. And now that Shona's back, I'll also reach this out. Shona, I reached this out to Dr. Leslie as well, but how do you reach out to the instructional coaching piece? I understand that you're talking a lot about the students, but how do you start to integrate these practices to teachers who may struggle with these particular feedback issues and providing these things in their classrooms?
What I'm doing right now is I'm working with teachers as writers. And so I'm giving them feedback to their writing that they are using as models and mentor texts with their students. And then the other thing that I'm doing is I'm meeting with them to review how they could give feedback to student writers. So they bring a paper and we talk about it like that.
I'll tell you one thing from my work, since you asked me as well, is that the instructional coach is pivotal to everything that happens with teachers in a school setting. So if you have a really strong instructional coach, it's critical that you are on the same page with that person. And so somebody like me who's coming in from the outside, it's really important to develop that relationship, and that can take some time. But again, it's very similar to what Dr. Rose is talking about with feedback to students. It's the same kind of thing that we want to guide teachers, and in this case, a teacher leader and a pivotal teacher leader, to be thinking about their practice and kind of moving them along. So that's my response. And it can take a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience, but ultimately the end goal is the payoff is so huge. It's worth it. So I hope that kind of answered your question.
Well, it does. We've ran into a lot of resistance. We had an instructional coach. Our administration, a new administration came in, removed them. He was an English teacher, but he provided feedback across content areas. You know, there are teachers who have tried. You know, in this COVID era, we're very limited in the resources that we can have, but because we lost half a year's budget, you know, for example, I bought books. And so when I give a student a book, that's it. They get to keep the book. I don't get to get it back. Right. And so in trying to implement these practices and provide feedback in elective periods, because we're short on teachers and we're trying to be creative, you know, I'm falling on deaf ears, but I know that you and Dr. Rose are basically coaches, and the more tools we have and the more ammunition we have to go back to them to say, look, this is critical right now. in this online, Z talked about the asynchronous format. We're cut across all the way across our program. And so hearing that kind of stuff is always reaffirming, but having the documents that come with it to say, look, this is what's happening, and this is what's working, would be incredibly beneficial. Sorry,
So,
Shona, I didn't
and
mean
you
to cut
have
you
to
off.
No, you're good.
You have to speak their language. Like you have to, this is one of the things I love about Dr. Rose's work is that she's making all these connections to the STAR writing test, and that we have to not just sort of set that at the side and say that's just one thing and it's all about this other. You have to integrate all of that. It's just so important. And the last thing I'll say is that we're really looking to cultivate transformative coaches. And there's kind of some new literature on what makes for a transformative literacy coach that was put out by the International Literacy Association. That's just so, so important to think about, like, who's coaching the coach and how are we doing this? Because there's not a lot of models that delineate that effectively. A lot of times a literacy coach is somebody who's an effective classroom teacher. And that's based on administrative ideations and evaluations, and it could just be test scores. And suddenly they're put in this position where they're teaching teachers, and that's a whole different animal. You can be a very successful classroom teacher, but then working with adults, especially if you're in the same building from where you were as a teacher, that can be really tricky, and it takes a different skill set. So it's an area that's worth so much investigation, and so much more research is needed. And the last thing I'll say on this topic is just that the coaching model is changing across the United States. Where coaches, we talk about it as waves. Like in the first wave, they were pull-out people who would, like Title I teachers, would take kids who were struggling with reading and writing and work with them individually. And then they kind of became more push-in, where they would go into the classroom and support the teacher, but they were not evaluative. They were just sort of there, as another resource in the classroom. And then in the third wave, they started to become more of this, like, I'm here to help you in a more formal way. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing now is that they have more and more evaluative and administrative teeth and power. They have more control over what's happening with curriculum, which if you have a great coach, that's fantastic. And that's where you get to this level of transformation, because then they have this power to really change what's happening. But again, they need coaching, and they need to be kind of replenishing their knowledge base constantly. So anyway, sorry, you should not have asked me.
No, I love that. And just connecting it back to the context of where we are right now. One of the things that you and I began talking about as this started was the problems that we're having. And the COVID thing, good or bad, has revealed some bad instructional practices, and it is causing worse ones. And we're seeing the impact on students and what they're doing. And I believe that if we want to get them back with us, if we want to transform how we teach, the way we give feedback to what they're doing in person or online is critical to their success.
It's so true. That was the driving force in starting this webinar series through the Llano Estacado Writers Alliance. Is just to be providing as many resources as we can during this time. Again, that moving seamlessly from face-to-face to online instruction, so that at any point we're ready to go, and that we don't panic, and we have all the tools and the methods at our fingertips that we need.
Yep. Well, I am just so honored and tickled pink that you guys were here with me digging into this. It's, whenever you have a passion like this, to have somebody that would engage with your ideas and participate and spend 6 to 8 o'clock after teaching is a huge deal to me, and I am eternally grateful.
Yes, and I'll just say, are there any final questions? There have been some great comments in the chat, and really great insights. And thank you all for being part of this tonight. If there's no final questions, then I just sincerely want to thank Dr. Rose for giving her time and her energy and her knowledge. And she did tell me that this could be part 1 of a part 2. because we got to planning and we didn't get to the next part. So stay tuned. There will probably be another webinar with Dr. Rose in the near future.
Oh, thanks you guys.
Thank you, everyone. And again, if there's no final questions, then I think we will wrap this up. Have a great evening.
Shona, make sure you get a hold of us for our little writing workshops that we're having. I got to talk to you about that.
Oh, okay.
We're starting some stuff up with Dr. Leslie and Dr. Jung and everyone. So just remind me.
Thank you, Z. You had great feedback. Yeah, I will. Nice.
So.
It was nice to see you. Bye. Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Dr. Leslie.
Thank you.
Loy, that was amazing. Thank you. Manny, appreciate you. Jennifer and Pinson, appreciate you.
Thanks, Texas Tech. All right.
Wow.
That's awesome. I just wanted you to know before we end that there was somebody here from Brazil.
What?
Yeah. Yeah. Dorotea. Did you see the name Dorotea?
No.
Yeah. She was here for, she wasn't here right at the beginning and she left at 7:30 because she said it's 9:30 my time. I really need to go. But
yeah.
This is great. I will do this again. I said it was so nice to see you.
Oh, it was. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
It's super exciting.
I appreciate you. This is.
Oh my gosh, I appreciate you. What you've done is just tremendous. And I wish we'd had a bigger audience, but I know that you speak to all kinds of people. And so you will continue to kind of get this message out that's just so important and helps us all kind of stop and think.
I felt weird that they were so quiet.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Jennifer, are you still here with us? Oh, no, there she goes. I was just about to say, I don't know if she walked out of the room and realized we were ending.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, there was a lot of activity and there were some people who started dropping off like at 7 or whatever, but it was okay. You know, this is the reality. Like you said, it's the end of a day and a lot of people are tired. So you did a great job, as I knew you would, being kind of our inaugural person for this.
Thank you.
And I can't thank you enough. This is
Thank you. Me either. It's the same. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I'm going to go eat and.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
This video, I'll stop the video recording when it drops, you know, because it takes time for it to actually